Hello, this is Randy Ellefson from Worldbuilding University and the Art of Worldbuilding, and you are about to watch a replay of the live Worldbuilding webinar from July of 2020. So welcome to webinar number 2 for Worldbuilding. It is July 25th, 2020, and I've got a number of questions that have been emailed in to me in advance. And if you guys have any questions at the time, feel free to chime in the chat box. I know a number of people can't join us today, but they'll be watching the video replay, which will be on YouTube soon, probably next Thursday. So the first question I'm going to go through is one from Abigail. She says she has an idea for a humanoid species with almost rock-like skin, but she needs them to be killable in battle. Is there a less gruesome way than shooting them through the eyes? And yeah, that's pretty gruesome. You know, some people will get squeamish just hearing that. We don't even have to graphically describe it to them for them to get a little grossed out. And if that's something that happens early on in our story, they might think that we're just going to be writing some graphic stuff, you know, graphic violence and tune out. So the first thing that comes to mind to me is that even though they may have rock-like skin, typically the joints need to be softer so that we can actually move. You know, if you were really like a rock, you'd be stuck. So under the armpits, the necks, back of the knees, that kind of area is going to be softer. So that's the sort of go-to solution for this. It's kind of a cliche, but it's so realistic that no one's really going to be bothered by that, I think. Another potential solution for this is to invent special weapons that do have the ability to pierce their skin. And you said it's rock-like, so it's not necessarily rock, it's rock-like. That gives us some flexibility to decide that we can invent a weapon that may not pierce straight through rock, but it can pierce through this rock-like skin. Maybe there's just enough difference between that skin and rock that we could actually pierce through the skin. One of the advantages of this is that if we do have special weapons to pierce this rock-like skin, that means that there are people who make those weapons can be valuable, and we may also have people who are trained in using those weapons and specifically training or killing that kind of rock-like species. So the reason that's good is that it gives us other things that we can create in our world building to tie it all together and make it not seem like there's just this creature with rock-like skin and nobody can get through it, and that's the end of that. You know, people are gonna, in the early part of that, the interaction with that species, they're gonna find it to be a problem, but sooner or later, someone's gonna think of a solution. There might even be weapons that could soften that skin. For example, something like a chemical weapon or even a spell that would do the same. I'm sure there are ways of liquefying rock on Earth that we could probably look into and see if that might possibly be something we can apply. Some of that may make more sense if we're writing science fiction, but certainly with magic, we can get away with also softening that skin of a rock-like species so that weapons can pierce through it. So that is that's where I would start with that one. The next question I'm going to answer is from Joe. He asked, how can I make a fictional town map that is modern? And my way of doing this is to use City Designer from Pro Fantasy. And when I'm trying to do this, I have a hard time thinking of city layouts personally. So what I will often do is take a Google Street View map, well, not a street view, but you know, the typical overhead view where you're looking down on it. And I will take one of those and I will find parts of the layout that I like, and not the whole thing, but parts of it, and make a screenshot of that. And you can actually import something like that screenshot into a program like City Designer from Pro Fantasy and use it as a background. And then you can essentially trace over it or place buildings on top of stuff and eventually hide it so that you don't see it. One of the advantages to doing this is that you don't have to figure out the layout from scratch yourself. You can also borrow some cool ideas that have been done in the real world. And then if you can't draw, you've already got this kind of schematic there. That's also a good thing to do if you are lacking for ideas on how to lay out your city. Let's see, the next question I'm going to answer is from Beth. She asks, what world building mistakes should I avoid? Well, there can be a pretty big list of these. One of them I would say is spending too much time on it when you're not going to use those items that you're creating. This is something that I am guilty of myself. You know, it's easy to get sucked into world building, so always be thinking, what can I use this for? And, you know, am I going to be able to use it at all? this is one of the reasons why it's a good idea to do world building specifically for the story that you're working on, because that tends to keep you focused on a goal instead of just kind of going everywhere with it. Another world building mistake is breaking the rules of your own world. There are several ways of going around this. One of them is to say your rules in a flexible sort of way. So for example, if I narrate, magic users must do 3 years of training, otherwise they can't actually perform magic. Well, by saying must, I've locked myself into that. I've made it a rule or a law or something. But if I say something more vague, like typically they need 3 years of training, well, that gives me some flexibility. So it's not a rule. And therefore, if I have a character who only did it after a year and a half, well, then I didn't break my rule because I didn't say it as a hard and fast rule. So this is one way that I like to kind of hedge that. I think we often try to get things right. And one of the ways we can trip ourselves up is stating rules that we then later get wrong. Our own rules we get wrong. So don't make it a hard and fast rule. Another world building mistake is forgetting what you said earlier in a book and then contradicting yourself later. This is especially true if you're writing a series, because the more books you write, there's more stuff that you have said, and then you can contradict yourself. So what I just talked about is one way of dealing with that, but I would really recommend taking good notes. And then when when I write a book and I'm done, I'll go in typically in order, but when I'm done with the whole book, I'll let it sit. I have a list of things that I look for when I go back for a read through all the way from beginning to end. And one of those is anytime I said something that sounds like a world building rule, I make sure that I have a note of that somewhere. I try to do that when I'm actually creating those things or when I'm writing the scenes, but it's also a catch-all for after the fact. And you can also ask your beta readers, if you have friends of yours or if you hire someone off of Upwork, to be on the lookout for that. Just tell them, look, is there any world building conflict that I have put in there? So there are several catches we can do to try to prevent that from happening. And I would recommend putting all of those in place, because just like when you hire 3 beta readers, one of them is going to notice some things, another one's going to notice different things. So if you try to make a note of this when you're doing the writing, check it yourself when you read through the whole book after you're done. And then when you are asking your readers to go through the book before you publish it, have them do it. You can also go ask your editor to do that. Of course, another world building mistake is doing way too much exposition. So this is something I think we're all aware of. And as you know, the reason people, I just did a writing mistake. As you know, Bob. So as you know, Bob, you're not supposed to go on and on about exposition, starting it with a phrase like, as you know, Bob, and then explaining something that people already know. So one of the problems with this is that if we have created too much stuff, we can find ourselves tempted to go on and on about it. And it's just something to be aware of. That's another big mistake to avoid. Another one is about analogs. If you duplicate someone else's idea exactly and you don't really change much about it, this is a world building mistake. 2 examples that come to mind are from The Lord of the Rings. We had the Hobbits, and of course that's copyrighted by Tolkien, so no one else can call them that. So in Dungeons and Dragons, we had halflings, and it's basically exactly the same thing, but they call it something else. The other example is also from Lord of the Rings. The Ents become treants, which is not exactly the most sophisticated way of disguising what it was. It's almost like they were poking Tolkien in the eye. Hey, we stole your Ent idea and we put it over here and we called it treants. Like no one's going to realize it's the same thing. Even if they hadn't done that, people would have figured it out. So that would be another world building mistake. I think another one that I have sometimes run into is not knowing when to give up on something if it's a bad idea or it's not working or you just keep running into problems. So sometimes it helps to know maybe this idea isn't working out and I should back off and come back to it later, or just forget about it altogether. So those are some of the big world building mistakes that first come to mind when I saw your question, Beth. Let me see, who else asked a good one here? All right, Justin has a good one. This one is, how do you start world building? Well, I start with the many resources that are available to get and what is possible. You can look at YouTube videos, you can look at my books, there are lots of blogs. Basically, it's a good idea to look at all the advice that other people have given out there for mistakes you can make, like I just talked about. But at the end of every chapter in my books, I talk about where you can start with that particular item. There's also the accelerated world building course that kind of walks through what to do and what not to do. But my other basic idea is to know your goals before you really get too far with your world building. If you are world building for a specific story, then that is a good idea to focus on the needs of that story. And then if you're world building for a setting that you're going to use for maybe 10 years, that's the kind of thing where you can let yourself get a little more carried away with some of the world building that you do. And then aside from that, I think it really pays to just know where you're planning to go with all of this work, and how are you planning to use it. So and I think the other thing that comes to mind for me is anytime you have an idea, or just run with that idea and don't worry about getting it right. There's really no such thing as getting a lot of things right in world building. It's more getting it plausible. I always like to joke that no one from your world is going to show up and say, that's not true. These mountains are really 15,000 feet tall, not 10,000 feet tall. The author doesn't know what he's talking about. Just to use a silly example, but I would say that it can be tempting to try to get it right, but the side effect is that can cause us to become hesitant, and we start to get kind of like a writer's block, or almost a world builder block, where we just don't work on it anymore because we're worried about getting it wrong. I would always just go ahead and put it down, do what you can, and then I do a lot of revisiting things later and fixing it later, and sometimes it seemed like a good idea at the time, and then later I realized maybe that wasn't a good idea. So I would say always start with whatever you have an idea for, and then just run with it and see what you can do. And don't worry about getting it right, or if it's not making sense. If you see plot holes in it, then just note them. Maybe you'll think of it immediately as a solution. Maybe you'll think of it in a week, or maybe in a year. So I would always say start with whatever you have an idea for. All right, Jessica asked, what are the 5 most important questions to answer when world building? Well, I don't know if there are really some that are the most important, but one of the ones that came to mind is, what do I need to invent? Sometimes we want to invent stuff, or we feel like we have to because it's expected, but what do we really need to? So it can help to identify the bare minimum. And that way, it's another way of trying to prevent ourselves from going off on tangents that we just end up wasting time, and maybe it's not going to be end up used. Another thing is, when do you want to be done by? If I want to start writing my book 3 months from now, then I have 3 months to do planning, which is not only for the story, but for the world. So I think it's very good to answer that question, because otherwise we can just end up going indefinitely. And it may not be when we want to be done world building by. It might be when we want to start that book. It might be when we want to finish writing that book. So try to think out and give yourself some soft deadlines on when you'd like to get done by. I think we all know hard deadlines for creative people don't really work, and they don't exist. We can do one, but then we're not going to make it, and then we might get upset with ourselves for that. So I always feel like I don't have to point out it's a soft deadline. That's assumed. Another important question for world building is, what are your goals? Is it to tell that story, or is it to create a setting you can use for multiple worlds? And then another important question is, where should you start? And then let's see, the other one I have here, is the idea that you're working on a good one, and is it worth pursuing? I think these are some of the most important questions that you can ask as you start your world building. Linda asked, how much of a problem is inconsistency in a fictional world? And the first thing that comes to mind is, it depends on how obvious that inconsistency is. If you have a major plot point where a character can't do something, and that causes all sorts of chapters of stuff to happen, and then later on that character can't do that, you're sort of invalidating a whole bunch of things that happened. And one example of this that comes to mind from years ago is the TV show Lost. And I may be remembering this incorrectly, but I'm pretty sure that there were these 2 guys who were supposedly on the island way before the main characters showed up. And their mother essentially told them, I have made it impossible for either of you to hurt each other. Well, then in the second to last episode, or maybe it was the third to last episode of the entire series run, you find out one of the guys killed the other one. And so many of the things that had happened in so many of the episodes were the guy who was killed had become this smoke monster. I hope I'm not spoiling anything for you guys, but he had become this smoke monster, and he was always trying to cause other problems on the islands for the main characters and for his brother that had killed him a long time ago. And the whole idea seemed to be the smoke monster can't hurt him, so therefore he's got to hurt him by going after the main characters. And I'm like, well, wait a minute, why can't he hurt the guy? So it invalidated the whole thing for me. And so that is a really obvious, it's a plot hole, not only just in the story, but in the entire series. So if it's inconsistent and it's that big of a thing, then that's a huge problem. If it's relatively minor, sometimes it's not a big deal. And again, we can give ourselves some plausible deniability by being a little bit softer about what we've said is a rule and what isn't. This is all one reason to work out your systems, whether it's a magic system, an educational system, or legal health systems, because we don't want to do something like have a character be unable to be healed by medicine in science fiction on in a specific society on a planet, and then 10 minutes later or the next episode, another character is being healed that exact way. Unless we have an explanation for this, like at the first instance, there wasn't any medicine to do that, and a new shipment has arrived, and now it can be done. So I think part of it is knowing when you have an inconsistency. The scary thing is not knowing you've done that. And then this is one of the things to ask your beta readers for, is there anything about this that doesn't make sense? And we can work out some things that are pretty complicated and not realize that we have a inconsistency in there somewhere. I've done this myself with a book of mine called The Dragon Gate, which I'm hoping will be out next year. The backstory on the scenario that the characters got sucked into was so much more involved than I had intended. And I sat on that book for a long time because I couldn't figure out how to solve some of those problems, but at least I was aware of them. And, I recently finished that book and I gave it to some beta readers, and they still found a couple inconsistencies that I was able to, not notice. So it can be tough. This is something you need to be on guard for. Let's see. Steve asked, what's an effective way to reveal exposition? We talked about this a little bit in the last webinar. And one of the ways is to make it relevant to the moment. It's usually not a good idea to do some sort of big info dump, something like at the prologue, and then many chapters later, it becomes relevant. People are not going to remember that, partly because they don't know what they should focus on and what they can just ignore. So always try to make it relevant to the moment. I like to also have a scene that is designed to reveal that world building. So I'm trying to think of a good example here. In one of my stories, I have these characters who, it's a species that has a very different idea on personal property. Instead of just explaining that they don't really believe in personal property and they just take stuff and people accuse them of stealing, the whole story was actually written around that idea. There's a main character who is, I created it to have her be really rigid about her own home. She wants things in their place. I think there's some line from Tom and Jerry, everything in its place. Oh no, it's the Jetsons, the maid. We should always say everything in its place and a place for everything. Probably dating myself for that reference from the 1970s, but this character was the same way. She liked her orderly house, and she was forced to move to a place where the species called Quera lived, and the Quera will just open your front door and walk right in, and they'll just help themselves to anything. And if they see you, they'll be like, "Hi, how you doing?" And they don't seem to notice this is your place, it's your stuff, so they have a very different attitude. So the whole story was written around that. So I never had to explain it. I showed it in the form of the interactions between these characters. And at the risk of ruining the ending of the story, the joke on the world was that these characters will drive you crazy to the point where they have actually killed people because they caused that person to have a heart attack. And so that's exactly what happens in the story. By the end, the woman has gotten so upset about all these intrusions and it's been going on repeatedly during the book, and they talk about it, that she comes up with a way she thinks she's going to upset the squarer by doing something, and as it turns out, he behind her back, he does something and then upsets her. So she sets a trap to kind of stick it to this guy who's always helping himself. It would almost be something like putting poison in something so that when he comes in and he helps himself, he drinks the poison and kills himself. It wasn't that, but it was that kind of thing where she sets a trap, and instead of getting him, she ends up getting herself. And so I made the whole story be about this issue So hopefully I never have to explain in narration that this is what goes on with the species. I've got a whole story that shows what they do and what they're like. And that was kind of a long answer, but we had a couple minutes, so I wanted to give you an example of this. So another good way to reveal exposition is an inner monologue. This is great because you can actually write your narration, the exposition that we are all afraid to stick in there because someone's going to come after us. The exposition police will show up and arrest us. Well, one thing you can do is write it as exposition, and then you can subtly tweak the language to make it the character's thoughts instead. And the way I typically do this, I will have the character be reacting to something, in the space of their head. They may have reacted out loud. They may have said something to another character. Maybe they saw something that has triggered some angst about this thing, and now they're thinking, "Now I really hate this because of this, that, and the other thing." And in the form of saying their thoughts, it comes across as characterization and as something that's in that scene, relevant to that moment. It doesn't come across as some info dump where the narrator, me, my voice is putting this in there. It's the character's voice. So this is a really subtle sleight of hand trick that you can use. I would recommend just writing it as the exposition that you want to say, partly because that helps you figure out what you want to say and what you don't need to say, and then alter this in such a way that it becomes the character's thoughts. Have them react to something and then have them pretty much go right down the line of things that you said as their reaction. Let's see what else. I always write little notes to myself for how I'm going to answer these questions. The other one that I just kind of alluded to for how to get across exposition is characters to talk about it. But like I was talking about a minute ago, that expression, "as you know, Bob," that is the bad way of doing that. A cliche is to have an ignorant character there, and that person is the one who is having things explained to them. That can work, but you have to watch out for that because it is a cliche by itself. I prefer to have two characters arguing about that subject. So there's no knowledgeable person and an ignorant person, and the knowledgeable person's going, "Well, as you know, Bob," it's not that kind of conversations. It's someone has an opinion about it and says it, and the other guy goes, "No, that's not true," and they start arguing about it. An example from the Everfiend book that's available, which I have sitting right here. There's a scene in here where the Corellian character says to the main character, Talon Stormbringer, he says something, "Oh, you have gray eyes," and this starts this argument. What I was getting at in the whole scene is there is a myth on this world called the iris myth. The iris is the part of your eye that's colored. The way it goes in this world, I have 7 groups of gods. Some of them are basically evil, some of them are basically good. Each of those groups of gods, they created a species. So if there's 4 gods in the blue group, they created one species called Jeken, and those guys have blue eyes. And I did that with all of them. Well, at some point, all of the gods got together, and as one group, they made the humans, which of course had all the colors mixed together. And as a result, they have brown eyes like mine. And so there's an idea that if you are a human in this world and you have blue eyes, well, maybe you have an ancestor that actually is from that species. And in this case, that species is considered evil because 4 evil gods in that blue group of gods created them. So it's a way of saying you're evil. And in this case, the character Talon Stormbringer has eyes that appear gray or blue, depending on the lighting. And so I decided to have this other character, Corellia, say, "Hey, you have gray eyes. You know what that means?" And Talon had heard this before. I made some comments in the narration that he had beaten up a couple kids when he was younger because someone tried to say he was a bad guy because his eyes were blue or gray, and so they end up having an argument about it. And so right now, I just did a bunch of exposition explaining it to you. It was probably not the most exciting way of explaining it to you because that's dry exposition. The better way of doing it was in the book where the characters argue about it. But when I wrote that scene, there was a moment in there where I realized, I can't have them say everything out loud to each other. So what did I do? I let Talon think, let's say they make 6 comments back and forth. And then finally, there's a paragraph of narration from Talon's point of view where he is thinking through this whole stupid myth, or as he thinks of it as stupid myth. Whether it's true or not, I don't say in the book. In fact, I'm not even sure off the top of my head. Is it true? Well, maybe it isn't, because I don't want to say in my books, yes, this is definitely true. And so, obviously this human character, could have blue eyes for no reason whatsoever, just like we do here on Earth. But on this world of mine, Lorien, some people think it means something and it causes arguments. This is how we can get across this kind of stuff. Oh, I got one from Marcus here. He said he wants to build a country from the ground up, and he wants to know, how would I go about starting? Well, I try to use my physical environment in the world as much as I can. I do this when I'm creating a species. I start with what is their habitat? Are they forest dwelling? Because that's going to cause certain things. So with a country, I would decide on where it's located. If it's by the sea, then that could mean that they have a good sailing industry, or they could have other countries that are better founded or older, and those are the ones that are good at sailing. And as a result, this one is not, maybe they're not good at it, and as a result, they get beaten on the seas a lot. So maybe they have alliances with one or two of the others, or maybe they have really good fortifications in their port to prevent these attacks. So this is the kind of thing we can do using the setting to our advantage. If we know where the nearest mountain range is, that can help us know whether there is vegetation on one side and desert on the other, and which side of this mountain we want to put our city, so we know what kind of wildlife is going to be there. This also helps with products. If you are by the sea, but you're also surrounded on land by a desert, you don't have any trees, well, you're not going to be the kind of seafaring power that another one would be, because it does have a forest where it can get all the wood that it needs to build ships. So if you were this desert surrounded port city, where are you going to get your ships? You're going to have to either capture them, which is going to be hard in the beginning, or you're going to have to steal them, or you're going to have to buy them from somebody else, or create these alliances. So this is always where I start. Use the physical environment for deciding some of the basic elements that are going on in this city. And he asked about a country, but you can do the same thing on the broader scale with a country. There will be parts of that country that will have access to forest, most likely, or some that won't. There are entire countries on Earth that are landlocked or which are surrounded by other countries. And so that can be another issue where it's really going to have an impact on something like the type of government they have, the resources that are available to them. So I would always start with the physical environment. All right, well, I think we're going to wrap up. I do want to thank all of you for participating, and for everyone who sent in a question. I'm hoping we can do this regularly. It's fun for me. It's nice to be able to interact. Oh, wait, I got one from Adari here. You just made it in. Let's see. How do you limit scope creep? I have so many ideas and don't know how to consolidate them into a believable story world. That is a good question. So, well, my question to you would be, are you trying to create them to create all that for a specific story, or are you trying to create a world from which you can, create multiple stories? For mine, I'll wait if you're typing an answer. For mine, I have one world that I've been using for many years. I am very guilty of scope creep, and I just let myself do things, and then I come back to it later if I have an opportunity. I know I'm going to use it eventually. One of these days, I'm going to stop fooling around with distractions and get on my own fiction writing more. But I think it has a lot to do with knowing your goals to avoid scope creep, and always have that question in the back of your mind, or even just write it on something and tape it to your computer monitor. Do I need this? Okay, so you're doing what I do. You said you're trying to create a world to grow stories from. Something, my main world, Lorien, that is actually where I get my story ideas from. So in that case, I would almost say you don't have a scope creep problem. It's an inherent part of the world that you have, where you are creating stuff. And I think the issue really is that you may create stuff, and at the time, you may not have a use for it. And you may be wondering, am I ever going to have a use for this? I do that quite a bit. I still have a whole continent that I did a map for a couple of years ago, and I have barely done any of the sovereign powers. I mean, they're all there. I've got the files, but I haven't gone through any of them and decided what they're like. And so this is an issue where sometimes I wonder, I've got this huge resource that I could exploit more, and did I waste my time? And as far as scope creep, I don't think so, because I plan on writing for many years. I think the trick maybe is to start integrating some of what you've created, or focus on some of the ones that you've created that seem the most suggestive of a story idea, and then see, okay, do I have a story idea for this? Well, what am I missing from a story standpoint, not only plot, but character standpoint, but what else might be missing from the world in order to flesh this out? And see if you can kind of focus on that that one story idea using a certain amount of what you've got there, and then start trying to bring it together. You may not get all of it now, but that's okay. But you'll start kind of pulling it together. Let's see, Mark asked on the first question about rock people. So I talked about a weapon that would work on these rock people, and would you want the people who are wielding those weapons to be immune to the effect, or is it dangerous to them also? Which would offer the most interesting options? Well, it's always more interesting when there's more danger than when there's less danger. Maybe in the real world we like it without that, but I would say that, yeah, if this weapon that deals with the rock people, if it can, let's say it's something that has a wide spraying effect and you can accidentally get yourself with it, then that's obviously a problem. Maybe you need to wear protective gear when you use this, or maybe you can only implement this at certain times. Maybe it's something you can spray it out of a hose. If it's some sort of like a liquid that can soften their skin, but it's corrosive to your own skin. Maybe it doesn't do the same thing to your skin, but maybe you get a rash. Maybe it's a minor rash, but maybe it's something that actually makes the limbs start to die, and it's going to have to be cut off. I would say side effects are great because, first of all, it's believable, it's realistic. It also gives us other story points. We could have a situation where the people who are wielding those weapons on the rock people, well, now they have to take precautions. They can't just, carelessly fling this at the rock people or whatever, and not worry about side effects. It could also be something that's damaging to the earth. And maybe that's a problem. Maybe it's leaching into the water. And next thing you know, they're poisoning their own water supply. It could be something where, if that's the case, maybe they only use those weapons far away from home. So it's a really important thing for the rock people to be kept at a certain distance, because if they come too close and they're at the city walls and people are using that weapon, it poisons their own water supply. Now we've got a real problem. And so that can, again, give our characters something where they say, okay, we need a force of, let's say, horsemen who are specially trained in this, and they go out and they create a perimeter 25 miles from the city where these rock species people, they can't come within there, because if they do, they're going to be so much harder to defeat. So yeah, I would definitely go with something that has a side effect. If it's more like a bladed weapon, that's a little harder to find a side effect for, but anything is possible. So that was a good question, Mark. Thank you. All right, so I think I'm going to wrap up for this one. I hope to see you guys at the next one. Thank you for joining me. It's been great to see you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thanks. If you're unfamiliar with my work on world building, what follows are some short videos, some of which contain info about free resources. The video description has more info as well. Thank you for watching. By the way, if you'd like more stuff to help with world building, my artofworldbuilding.com site has a bunch of free templates that you can download by joining the mailing list. You can click the link in the episode description or the little information button in the upper right-hand corner. There are over 20 of these templates, as you can see from this list. Most of them are Microsoft Word documents, but the 2 calculator ones, which come from my Creating Places book, are Excel spreadsheets that take care of the math for you. You can just type in measurements from a map and find out how long it takes to go somewhere by dragon, wagon, foot, or even ships. If you're enjoying the video, remember to click the like button and subscribe. By the way, this YouTube channel is based on my best-selling book series, The Art of World Building, so if you'd like all this advice written down somewhere, it already is. There's also more detail on everything we're talking about in the books, which are available in ebook, paperback, hardback, and audiobook. They can be found at many libraries, bookstores, and most online retailers like Amazon. Just click the links in the episode description. There's also another book related to the series called 185 Tips on World Building. The content is drawn from all 3 volumes, and this book is usually free as an ebook on Amazon and at other retailers, or sometimes it's only 99 cents. By the way, I founded Worldbuilding University, and you can browse the course selection to see if I've uploaded a course you might like. The link is below in the description. Also, and this is important, if you subscribe to my newsletter, I give out coupon codes for courses, including one to get the Accelerated Worldbuilding course for free. It's normally $49. I may put a coupon code in the episode description here, but I can't promise to keep up with that every month. Check it out at worldbuilding.university.